Good afternoon. My name is Duff Conacher. I am co-founder of Democracy Watch. I am here today presenting Democracy Watch's views as Canada's leading democratic reform and government ethics and government accountability advocacy organization in terms of the House Ethics Committee's review, the first review since 2012, of the very key democracy and good government protecting law, the Conflict of Interest Act, one of the most important democracy laws that we have at the federal level. I am presenting this afternoon before the House Ethics Committee at 4:30. Democracy Watch's call for changes to this important law and related changes to other ethics codes at the federal level. The federal government's ethics law is unfortunately a sad joke, and the House Committee must recommend closing a dirty dozen loopholes in the law. The loopholes allow the Prime Minister, cabinet ministers, their staff, and top government officials, the most powerful decision makers in the federal government, to all secretly profit from their decisions. Loopholes also allow for blind trusts that are not actually blind, and ethics smoke screens that hide but do not stop conflicts of interest. The Conflict of Interest Act is so full of loopholes, it really should be called the almost impossible to be in a conflict of interest act. The loopholes mean that the act actually does not even apply to 99% of the decisions and actions of the Prime Minister, cabinet ministers, and top government officials and their staff. And to put it in the reverse, the Act only applies 1% of the time. That's how loophole-filled it is. There's more loopholes than there are law in the Conflict of Interest Act. It's unclear how rigorous the review of the House Ethics Committees will be of the Conflict of Interest Act. We'll see what happens as they review, but in the past, and the last review was, as I mentioned, in 2012, the committee essentially ignored key loopholes. The Conflict of Interest Act, despite applying to the most powerful decision makers in the federal government, is actually weaker than the rules for senators and weaker than the rules for federal government employees, including the rules that apply to public servants who have the least power in terms of decision making under the federal government system. That makes no sense at all. The rules are also as weak as the ethics rules for backbench MPs, who also have very little power in terms of decision making and policy making. All federal parties need to work together to finally close these loopholes and also to strengthen enforcement and penalties. The current ethics enforcement measure of a blind trust is completely ineffective because the trust isn't blind at all. The office holder knows what investments they put in the trust, they choose their own trustee, they're allowed to give initial instructions to the trustee such as don't sell anything, and the trustee is allowed to give them regular updates on the investments. The other enforcement measure that is backed by past ethics commissioners and also the current ethics commissioner Conrad von Finkenstein is the so-called ethics screen. It's actually an unethical smokescreen. It allows the office holder to secretly participate in almost every decision that affects their investments and to secretly profit from their decisions. As a result, the only effective way to actually end financial conflicts of interest is to require public office holders to sell their investments. This was recommended by a task force in 1984 that the federal government set up called the Starr-Sharp Task Force on Conflict of Interest. It was also recommended by the Parker Commission in 1987, headed by Justice Parker, also looking at conflict of interest. And Parker Commission and the Starr-Sharp also recommended that blind trusts not be allowed to be used. These recommendations have been ignored ever since. 40 years or so have passed. And it's clear that everyone that's been in power, and MPs from other parties too, who haven't really pushed to end this sham facade and sad joke of a law that's loophole-filled, it's clear that what they want is a system where they can secretly profit from their decisions, which is a corrupt attitude, not an ethical attitude. As the Dirty Dozen list of loopholes that Democracy Watch is also revealing today, and will be submitting to the committee with calls for measures to close each loophole. As that Dirty Dozen list details, some of the loopholes have been created by negligently bad enforcement by the Federal Ethics Commissioner since 2006. The former Ethics Commissioner, Mary Dawson, created ethics screens, which are, again, smoke screens that hide but don't stop conflicts of interest. And even though the law actually requires public disclosure every time a public office holder steps aside from a decision-making process, a discussion, or a vote. And she overrode that public disclosure requirement with this secretive ethics smokescreen system where there isn't disclosure, and it hides the fact that actually office holders are participating in almost every decision that affects their investments because of the biggest loophole in the Act, which is that the Act does not apply if you are making a decision, participating in a decision or discussion or vote about a general matter or about a matter that applies to a broad class of people or businesses or organizations. And those two loopholes together mean that because 99% of what cabinet ministers and top government officials and the Prime Minister deal with applies generally, that the law does not apply 99% of the time. The government, politicians, top government officials develop and propose general laws that apply generally. There isn't a Royal Bank Act, there's a Bank Act that applies generally. They change taxes in ways that apply generally. Tax credits, subsidies, spending programs, all of them apply generally, and the Act does not apply when you're dealing with a matter that applies generally. So 99% of the time, the Act might as well not be enforced. Again, it's almost impossible to be in a Conflict of Interest Act. Similar loopholes exist in the MP Code and the Senate Code, but as I mentioned, almost all of those loopholes do not exist in the ethics codes for federal government employees. So again, the lowest level federal government employee with the least decision-making power has to meet a higher ethical standard than the most powerful politicians, the Prime Minister and Cabinet Minister and top government officials. Democracy Watch will be calling today at the House Ethics Committee at the hearing at 4:30 this afternoon on opposition parties to propose and enact a private member bill that closes all the loopholes and strengthens enforcement and penalties if the Carney Liberal cabinet refuses to introduce a government bill to make the changes. Opposition parties have a majority of seats in the House, and so they can pass a bill. They did it in the last session. They passed a bill strengthening whistleblower protection. Unfortunately, it was derailed at the 11th hour when it was being reviewed by the Senate because of the prorogation that Prime Minister Trudeau did that led to the federal election. But opposition parties did pass it through the House, despite the Liberals not wanting the changes made to strengthen whistleblower protection. Prime Minister Carney also needs to reenact publicly the PM Code for ministers and their staff. It sets out much stronger rules that inform and define some of the key rules in the Conflict of Interest Act. The current version of the PM Code on Prime Minister Carney's website is the version from 2015 signed by Justin Trudeau. And this raises the question about whether he's planning to weaken or cancel that code and those stronger rules that the Ethics Commissioner has said are requirements. And if he does so, it will gut not only that code, but will also gut and make weaker the already weak loophole-filled Conflict of Interest Act. And it will add to Mr. Carney's negligently weak record and attitude so far concerning ethics, where he has hidden his investments and then used the unethical schemes of a not blind trust and an ethics smokescreen to maintain his investments of millions of dollars in 655 plus companies and continue making decisions that affect those companies, most especially the companies under the Brookfield conglomerate. Finally, many other changes are needed to federal laws to ensure democratic good government, including closing secret unethical lobbying loopholes, decreasing the donation limit, and banning big bank loans under the Canada Elections Act, because the current annual individual donation limit of $3,500 annually is essentially a system of legalized bribery. And also close huge excessive secrecy loopholes in the federal access to information law, the open government law, and strengthen the whistleblower protection law. Democracy Watch will be calling on the House Ethics Committee, which oversees all of these issue areas, to not only make strong recommendations to close the loopholes, strengthen enforcement and penalties in the Conflict of Interest Act, but also in all these other laws. There actually are no penalties in the Conflict of Interest Act for violating the key ethics rules that ensure that an office holder is not furthering their own or others' private interests and is instead upholding the public interest. And that shows how much the federal parties don't take this seriously, because why would anyone in cabinet follow these rules when there's zero penalty for violating them? They get away with it every time. They're kept in cabinet, as Mr. Trudeau has shown, kept several ministers in cabinet, even though they had violated this, one of the most important democracy-protecting laws that we have. And so not only do the loopholes need to be closed, but enforcement needs to be strengthened, and penalties need to be very significant and mandatory for every violation.